So now I would like to just give a short overview of what's going to happen. So I really wanted to take you through the way that this develops. So we're going to start with the early days, some of those organizations like IndieBio and SOSV, which were amongst the first to invest in these kinds of initiatives and companies. And GenSpace, which was the first community laboratory in the country, where people could just go and learn how to do biology. And we've got the pioneers of that here today to talk to you. And the HACS, which is a more recent invention, but an evolution out of SOSV, which is all about engineering for climate solutions and other things to make the planet more sustainable. So I'm going to invite Sabria Stukes, Susan Schofer, and Karen Ingram, all pioneers, to come up and talk about the work that they've been doing. So welcome, and thank you so much for being here. I would just like to start with Karen and maybe go down the line and have you introduce yourselves and just say a little bit about your work in this amazing field.
I'm Karen Ingram. I'm a creative director and designer, and I've been working in this field, I guess, for 10 years. And I'm one of the co-authors of the BioBuilder curriculum, and I'm a teacher or instructor at GenSpace, and I don't know, I've done a lot of things in this space. It's very exciting.
Awesome. I'm Susan Schofer. I'm a partner at SOSV. We're a global venture capital firm. And I'm also Chief Science Officer for HACS, which is our hard tech startup development program. We invest in really early stage companies working on deep tech and hard tech. We help them build hardware. And, you know, in terms of our passion for this space, you know, we think that biomanufacturing and the tools of biology are really important for the future of the bioeconomy. So that's really where we play a role here, is just in terms of enabling tools and helping teams that are working on biomanufacturing. Quick background, I'm actually a chemist, sorry. But I have a PhD in chemistry, was kind of lucky to, after my academic time, end up in industry, where I really was excited to see that science and technology can be applied to have a big impact, and have spent my career really working my way from research and development roles through to product development and on the commercial side. And I've spent a number of years in the biotech industry at a company called Amyris, and then also at Modern Meadow most recently.
Oh, I didn't know you were at Amyris.
Yep.
That's amazing. Amyris was one of the first companies to apply these techniques to energy.
Mm-hmm.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabria Stukes. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for IndieBio, which is the life science startup development program that's supported by SOSV. So I get to work very closely with Susan, kind of in supporting these early stage companies. My background is I have a PhD in biomedical sciences where I really concentrated on microbiology and immunology. So for a number of years I was working on infectious disease research. I'm originally from Virginia, but have been living in New York for, I think, over 17 years. I think they say after 10 years you sort of stop counting, but I went to grad school here. I was also a research assistant at the NYU School of Medicine, so you know, when we think about building biology or biotech companies here, I actually was able to watch the Alexandria Life Science Center kind of be built from the ground up from my lab window. So I have lots of experience, both, I think, in supporting the biotech community, both from a grad student perspective, but then once I left, I got my PhD at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, and once I left that job, or that space, I worked at the City College of New York, helping them build a brand new master's program in translational medicine, which trained scientists and engineers in the process of medical device commercialization. And then, so I did that for a number of years. And then I was the operations director for a small biotech company that operated out of J Labs. It was developing therapeutics for neurological disorders by synthesizing metabolites from the gut microbiome. So I did that for a little over a year before stepping into the role at IndieBio.
Great. Well, thank you. So, Karen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the early days of the community movement?
Sure, yeah. I guess I personally got involved with GenSpace about 10 years ago, and it was through a speaker series that I hosted called the Empiricist League. And both Dan and Ellen, who are founders of GenSpace, came and spoke at the Empiricist League. And the idea behind that was we would get researchers and scientists, and we even got the FBI to talk about topics in science and technology for like 15 minutes on a stage that's usually reserved for comedians and musicians. So I was really interested in the idea of like mixing up interest and introducing science to people in creative ways or in ways that they wouldn't expect. And we got a lot of enthusiasm from researchers and scientists in terms of presenting in front of that audience, because it was a hybrid of creative people from like the New York area and also researchers. But this image that is on the screen right now is from a pop-up bacterial painting lab that we did at South by Southwest. Some folks from GenSpace, including Dan and I, did it. And it was part of this BioArt exhibit that was hosted by GenSpace called Cut, Paste, Grow. And actually the catalog was for sale in MoMA, which started off a whole another series of things that will be discussed later. But yeah, very exciting times. I mean, this image is from 2013. So you can see this is a long time coming. And these are 200 Petri dishes painted with GFP, green fluorescent protein, that Nancy mentioned earlier, and RFP, which is from a coral. So the GFP is from jellyfish and the RFP is from coral. But yeah, 200 people at South by Southwest added a tile to that mosaic. Yeah.
Great.
Oh, and so this was also an extension of Cut, Paste, Grow. And what this was a field trip one of the co-organizers and I went to at MIT, where we observed Natalie Claudel teach a bacterial painting lab. And we went there with the idea of getting a petri dish, a sample of bacterial photography. So the idea is that you engineer a strain of K12 E. coli to respond to light. Because E. coli doesn't usually respond to light, but you put a transparency on top of the petri dish and put it in a bacterial darkroom, and the bacteria will make a picture underneath the darkness and the transparency. So anyway, we went to MIT and we did the lab and did it with the students, and I took pictures and was so excited to see my petri dish come out, and Natalie put it in the dark room, and it didn't turn out just like nothing happened. So I was really disappointed, but I was also kind of inspired, because I was what happened? How do you troubleshoot something like this? And so I basically put together this infographic and wrote an article about the experience, because I was incredibly inspired, and it went up on the GenSpace blog. And Natalie saw this infographic and then asked me to work with her on the BioBuilder curriculum. And so that book was published by O'Reilly.
Next slide, please.
This was a collaboration that was between myself and Natalie and Rachel and Katie. And it was also enabled by SINBRC. BioBuilder was founded in 2011. The BioBuilder Foundation was founded in 2011, and this book came out in 2015, and it's also out in Japanese and Russian. And I think there are some other translations that probably some students did as well. But yeah.
So a couple of things just jump out from your remarks. One is the marriage of art and biology from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That this has happened. It was the creatives that really drove this process of discovery and the industry emergence. It was really a bottom-up type of thing instead of a top-down type of thing, even though the NSF was funding some of these early efforts, and BioBuilder was one of the the first nonprofits to come out of Sinberg and attempt to begin the education process of students of how to do this kind of science. The second thing that struck me was this cut, paste, grow, which you kind of jumped over, but it's really the fundamentals of how this science gets done, right? You go in, you cut a part of the genome, you paste it somewhere, and then you test it to see if it's doing what you think it's going to do. And then you go back and do it all over again, and that's what actually drives the evolutionary process of these products. So that was amazing. And the other thing that you said, in the early days of this technology, as with almost any technology, whether it's the atomic bomb or whether it's engineering biology, there was a lot of fear around it. And the FBI got involved, early on to follow the community lab movement because there was a lot of concern about people being able to alter the genome in the natural world and release it without prior testing and oversight and security. So very early on, these kinds of ethical and security issues became paramount, but it also helped to drive the industry in a way that I think was more responsible because there was these oversight structures that were being driven by the scientists themselves, recognizing that this kind of oversight needed to be done. But it was kind of the wild days in the beginning, right?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's still fun, but it was really fun then, and it was cool to have a place like GenSpace to tinker with biology, and it still is. Yeah, it's still cool.
So Susan, tell us about SOSV.
In the early days?
Yeah.
Well, I was not there. So I'll tell you my version of the story. I mean, I think, and maybe lean on Sabria here to talk more about the early days of IndieBio, but, SOSV was founded by Sean O'Sullivan. He's our fearless leader, and I think that came out of, some of his early entrepreneurial work. He founded a company called MapInfo, so like an early version of MapQuest or Google Maps, that he had an exit on, and sort of that spurred him to then do some traveling. He's a pretty creative and think outside the box type of person, so he traveled and I know spent some time in Iraq, actually being like a freelance photojournalist, although he wasn't officially a photojournalist, but he weaseled his way into doing that. But then started investing some of his own money in what ultimately is now sort of SOSV1, like the first fund of the company, but it was really out of a family office, and did well doing that. But I think at some point started to really institutionalize that because wanted to be able to work more closely with startups. And so somewhere along the way, eventually got the idea, HAX was started in 2012 in Shenzhen in China as a small startup incubator working with companies who were building hardware, a lot more focused on consumer hardware than we are today. But I think in the early days of that, investing in these companies, supporting them, what the learning was there was that a lot of them were spending a lot of the capital that was invested actually on things like engineering and external firms like an IDEO or something like that to be able to help them build and do design work. So I think that's where the idea came along to kind of rethink the program and provide some more hands-on resources to teams to really be able to help them, because all the teams had common needs, right? They all have certain early stage engineering needs, and it's not easy or inexpensive to find those resources. So it had a cost, it took them time, it was kind of risky because they may not find the right people who could really build the way they needed to, which I think was the origin of then the HAX program starting and being this kind of program to help people who were trying to create hardware and take devices from lab prototype into something that they could start to show to customers. And then similarly, I think with IndieBio.
Yeah, so IndieBio was can everyone hear me?
Is this? Yeah, sorry, okay.
So similarly, IndieBio was started in 2013, but the program itself was first in San Francisco. And I think to support what Susan was saying, Sean really saw and had others around him, or he was investing in companies that needed more infrastructure, needed more financial resources that were coming out of the lab. And so he was, seeing these as others were, I'm sure, some would consider maybe crazy ideas, crazy technologies coming out of labs, but they didn't really have anywhere to go. And so IndieBio started in San Francisco with some benches, some lab space, so that these early stage scientists and researchers had a space outside of academia to tinker, to really say like what is possible. And so in 2019, New York State saw the success that IndieBio was having in San Francisco and said, we really need something like that here for our academic institution. I think, as we all know, or if you don't know, New York has the highest concentration of academic institutions, and I think we graduate the most life science PhDs out of any state. And I think a quarter of all clinical trials happen here, so it really did feel like a good place to bring a program, not just a program, but also an institution like SOSV to support the growing interest in scientists and researchers and engineers who said, like, I have a technology, I have a prototype, or I have an engineering tool, and I think it's going to be something that people want, but outside of academia, like, where can I go to test that? One thing I want to say about GenSpace, so like I said, I went to grad school here, and that's where I first learned about GenSpace. This was, so GenSpace's new offices are right over here, which are wonderful and beautiful. If you haven't seen them, I suggest that you go and do that. But they used to be housed on Flatbush Avenue in a place where, like, you had to cross your fingers and hope the elevator worked, and there were other, I don't even know if it was it like a circus or something? Anyway, pretty much. Yeah, that also was occupying the space. And I guess what I'm really trying to say is, as a grad student, when I learned about the GenSpace community, it felt really exciting what they were doing. And it felt almost, I don't want to say like illegal, because it wasn't, but it just felt like, there is something outside of academia that, as someone who's interested in science, can be a part of. And also there were other individuals who were not in academia, creatives, designers, artists, who were talking about science in a way that was not being taught to me, in my grad school days. So I imagine that energy, that excitement, I was not there, similarly as Susan, I was not there at IndieBio San Francisco when they were first, having these scientists and engineers come into their labs and just say, like, here's some money, kind of like figure something out. I imagine that same energy and excitement that I felt when I first learned about GenSpace is how people felt when they first learned about IndieBio. But I think that energy and excitement still exists today because of us knowing, like, and trying to figure out, like, what is possible in the space.
Yeah, so I think, the vision of starting SOSV and this kind of investment, Sean just really pushed ahead even when it was hard to understand what was actually happening. I remember touring the IndieBio labs before they opened in San Francisco and meeting some of the scientists who were starting the first companies there. And this was 10, 12 years ago, before anyone heard of eggs without chickens and meat without cows and new kinds of materials. I mean, there's lots of new companies now that are actively commercializing these products, but back then it sounded like craziness,
Yeah, and actually the word, I feel like the word illegal I used was not the right one. It felt like rebellious.
Yeah.
It felt like, I am leaving the confines and the safety of academia, and I'm interacting with people who are saying, well, not only like what is possible, but we're going to try. And I feel like that, for me as a grad student, was it was almost like a veil was lifted from my face, because I was like, oh wow, people are asking way better questions than I thought was possible about some of the tools and technologies that I was using, like, in a lab.
For me, as a creative person and a person that had worked in marketing and advertising, but also in digital technology, it felt like you were being let in early on the next new thing.
Yes.
And it was just so exciting to get your hands on the tools and to play and to go to the biotech crash course and all the things that I feel like in lots of ways are taken taken for granted by scientists and researchers. For someone who isn't a researcher to play like that is like really fun, you know? So I don't know, I never felt like that. I always was just kind of invigorated by it, and I felt, you know, like I knew a special secret, you know, but of course I would tell everybody, because here I am on the stage.
I think what's so important about programs like IndieBio, spaces like GenSpace, even, you know, things like the Biodesign Challenge, is that we definitely need these spaces for people to play and tinker, to ask these questions, but also to bring together people from what feel like disparate backgrounds in the same room working on the same problem.
Well, that's the thing that I learned, I'll say, because I did come from Amherst, right? I was at Amherst from 2010 to 2014 before I joined Modern Meadow, and so I moved all the way across the country from San Francisco to New York to join Modern Meadow. And, you know, what I was exposed to here that I hadn't seen as much on the West Coast, because there was so much more of an ecosystem around biotech, so much more industrialization happening around biotech, I would say, in Silicon Valley in general. When I came here, the notion of like mixing that with design was actually a new concept. And I did come to GenSpace in those early days on Flatbush, and it is kind of the Wild West. I mean, and there's lots of good things there, because I think at those interfaces are where a lot of very interesting innovation can happen. And it's great also to kind of the notion of bringing these tools to people that otherwise wouldn't be exposed to them. I think where I had come from was a bit of a more closed environment. Like, we're using the tools of biotech, and they're quite evolved, and that was pretty cool in its own way. But then to think about bringing that out there more into the world, to allow younger students to use that, to allow people to explore it from a different perspective, I think is just really great, because it sort of opens it up. And like you're saying, I think socializes it more so that it's not such a scary concept, but also evolves it, because so many new ideas come at those interfaces.
So just to give you an idea, I forget the name of the company now, maybe one of you knows it. It was company created glowing plants, and with the idea that we could grow trees that had lights in them, and that way you could light the world, right? And they crowdsourced the funding for this, so it wasn't organized funding. It was like anybody wanting to send money in to advance the concept. And they actually created a plant that glowed, and they promised to give one to anyone that participated in the crowdsourcing effort. And I remember the early discussions, like everybody was petrified that they were going to plant these in Central Park. And like they would get out of control, and you know, we would have all these lighted trees in Central Park. It was really a funny conversation.
Yeah, I remember that. At that time, the company's name was Glowing Plant, but then they changed their name to Taxa.
Yeah.
And I think it was like the first GMO campaign on Kickstarter, and it was like a big deal. And then after that, all GMO campaigns were like banned on Kickstarter because they were going to give out like free like seeds as a reward, and it was just like Kickstarter. Yeah. They shut it down.
Right. So that was some of kind of the early days. Maybe you want to say a little bit about where SOSV and the hacks are now, you know, the record that has transpired over the last 10 to 12 years from the very early days.
Yeah, so now, our new space opened in 2019 for IndieBio. In 2019. So we've been physically here for about 3 years, and as I said, I only joined IndieBio about a year ago. But we are on our 6th cohort, so we operate on a cohort model where we invest in 10 or 15 companies each cohort, so 2 cohorts a year, about 20 companies. We work with them over a 4 to 5 month period to really help them de-risk their technology, work on their business model, work on their branding, work on their go-to-market strategy, with the ultimate goal to make them even more ready for future investments than when they started the program. So I think where we are now and where we want to go, especially for the New York community, is continuing, and not just within these 5 boroughs, both New York City and state and beyond, and really thinking about the East Coast of how can we find and fund the best founders working on some of the most pressing human and planetary health problems. So we've obviously seen some great successes coming out of the IndieBio SF programs around cultivated meat, precision fermentation and things like that. And one of the areas and focuses for New York that we're really looking for is, as you can probably imagine, therapeutics, but also materials and chemicals. As Susan was saying earlier, really thinking about kind of this biomanufacturing and bioeconomy that lots of people are talking about, and for us really figuring out how we can intentionally and strategically support that.
Yeah, so HAX has evolved significantly since those early days that I was talking about, where it started with the notion that, hey, if we have our own engineering team, we can actually help teams accelerate and build hardware and really take those tools and apply them broadly as a platform capability of our own. So HAX has been operating out of Shenzhen in China, where, pre-COVID, that's where teams would go. So as they were accepted to the program, they would actually go spend their time in Shenzhen, which is really connected to kind of strategic sourcing and electronics manufacturing. So it's kind of a great place to be, because I think it taught our hardware and industrial teams really about the potential and how they need to think about as they're gearing up for taking their small scale idea that they were working on in a lab and thinking about industrializing that and really doing real manufacturing. That was really the place for them to see that big picture and the opportunities and how they needed to integrate with existing supply chains and all of that. But even pre-COVID, the HAX team was thinking about how we've always been investing globally, so we source teams from North America, but also from Asia and Singapore and Europe as well. Before COVID, we were already thinking, how do we get a footprint in the US? We had some operations at the San Francisco office that IndieBio has, but we hadn't had a operational footprint in the US up until now. So we did kind of a pretty broad search in North America to find the best location for that. We picked Newark, New Jersey, for a variety of reasons, in part because it has a really strong industrial and manufacturing history, in part because we could be so close to where IndieBio is built in New York City. So we're just across the river, and it's pretty easy to get between the two spots. New Jersey itself is really trying to become a tech hub and being a center for innovation. And we also have great support from the New Jersey Economic Development Authority. They gave us a $25 million grant to build our space there. So that's really been the evolution. We've had a lot of successful companies that we've been able to accelerate and take them from early days, investing a small amount of money into them until they get to, Series A rounds and really getting some substantial capital invested, but also great commercial traction around things like we have a great battery recycling company. We have a company that's focused on long duration energy storage. We have a company called R0, which is focused on a non-chemical way to sterilize and kind of decontaminate indoor spaces, which really took off during COVID. So that's been one of our big growth companies. We have a company called Opentrons, which was the reason I went to GenSpace in the early days in 2014, which has built liquid handling robots that are much more democratized and kind of easier to use for a broader audience. But anyway, now we're building our US headquarters in Newark, New Jersey. We're just building out that space right now, so we're planning to open it in the fall, but that'll be a 40,000 square foot space, similar to what IndieBio has, lots of co-working space for the teams that we support and the startups that we fund, as well as workshop space for them to build prototypes and do 3D printing and laser cutting and all of that. And then we'll also have a chemistry wet lab so that the teams working more on the industrial stuff will have space to actually do experiments and continue to de-risk their science.
Yeah, so just focusing on Opentrons for a moment.
Yep.
Opentrons came out of GenSpace and actually the NYU design program, right? Will Canine, who was the founder of that company, he wasn't a scientist, and he went through the IndieBio program in San Francisco. He and his partner were making robots that basically did pipetting, which is a very manually intensive scientific procedure, which all postdocs hate. And also it makes scientific results uneven, because if you're not measuring it properly, you can affect the results of what you're doing. So he automated that process, and their manufacturing facility was established in China. And he became the first unicorn, or Opentrons became the first unicorn company in New York City. And so, just kind of grew out of this network that was
Yeah.
flying below the surface in New York, underneath all of these big academic institutions that were focused on therapeutics and diagnostics.
Yeah, I mean, OpenTrons is a HAX company, and like
Yeah.
you're saying, went to China to participate in the program, and that must have been in around 2014 or 2013, maybe.
Okay, so they were hacks.
Yes, yeah, and we're able to build that. I think they continue to progress it. Obviously, the COVID pandemic, they were instrumental in being able to deploy that for testing and really make a difference, bringing New York back from COVID and being able to do so much testing so that people could actually resume normal
Right.
life after COVID. So yeah, that was a great success story, and actually, they're one of their founders is now starting something new through HAX. So yeah.
So that automated system was basically shifted during the pandemic and became the foundation for the technology of the Pandemic Response Lab, which is what Susan is talking about in terms of enabling testing to be done all over the city. It was really on the forefront of those efforts, so really played a role in history here in terms of New York City. So I'd love to throw it open to you have any numbers in terms of numbers of companies, numbers of investments, how much money companies have raised?
In terms of number of companies, I can at least say through the HAX program, we've invested in over 250 hard tech startups over the past 10 plus years. Our goal now is to invest in 100 companies over the next 5 years and have them come to our site in New Jersey. What else can I say? SOSV is deploying capital from Fund 5, so that's meant to be a $400 million fund. And because we're such early stage investors, but then we also do follow on, we invest, at least through HAX, invest in 25 to 30 new companies per year. But unlike IndieBio, we don't do cohorts, so we are pretty much looking at companies and investing in them and bringing them into the program throughout the year, 2 to 3 new companies per month.
Yeah.
Yeah, similarly, and I apologize, I'm like racking my brain for what is the number that our companies have raised so far, and I should know this, but at least for IndieBio New York, like I said, we are on our 6th cohort now, so we've graduated about 50 companies since we initially came in 2019, and one of our other goals, in addition to finding companies, is working with them and supporting them to stay in New York. We cast a wide net when we look for companies, and similarly to HAX's partnership with New Jersey, as I was saying earlier, New York State really worked with SOSV and IndieBio to give them financial resources in the tune of $25 million to help build out the space we have now. But working with them, they've also encouraged and emphasized, like I said, identifying companies that are in New York, but then also getting them to stay in New York. And as I'm sure many of you know, there's many new step-out spaces that are opening both in the city, in Brooklyn, in New Jersey, Long Island City, where we hope that once we bring companies to New York, they can see a wide variety of support and resources for them to stay and grow, so we can continue to have success stories like OpenTrons and others.
Yeah, and Brooklyn is really becoming a hotbed of this technology. So you're going to hear from all of the companies that are located in Brooklyn today. And, they're at BioBat, they're at SUNY Downstate, they're at New Lab, they're at Industry City, they're at the Urban Future Lab, they're at the NYU School of Engineering, and now we have the incubator and accelerator that's going to be established on Governor's Island for climate solutions. Yeah. So this is really emerging, the Navy Yard, as an area of competitive advantage for New York in terms of this science, this technology, commercialization, and where the companies want to be. So, and they're being housed in places like this, which is amazing because it all helps to spur that creativity. So let's open it up to some questions. Everybody too shocked to talk? Go ahead.
There's a question. Susan, what's the difference between maybe the MarTech and tough tech?
Oh, great question. So tough tech, as I understand their definition, because I'm less familiar with, but other people do call it that. I think, tough tech is really a term that I think the Engine up in Boston uses, and as I understand it, it's really very much foundational around scientific breakthrough. I think they're less interested in things that are perhaps more applied. So for example, for HAX, and we invest in hard tech, largely that's hardware, but what that definitely includes is like robotics and automation. So we have a lot of companies that are building robotics and automation because we feel like that's fundamental to really being able to enable, the future of manufacturing done in a sustainable way. Whereas tough tech, I think maybe is perhaps more scientific breakthrough only based. And hard tech is much more, how can we apply things? How can we layer them together? I'll give another quick example, which is a company in our portfolio called Gaia. So Gaia AI is actually using LiDAR technology. The founders came from the autonomous driving space, and basically have taken that same type of technology and now applying it to being able to use computer vision and LiDAR to be able to quantify and better capture data on forests and timber and trees. So really better MRV type methods to enable better, more validated carbon credits with forests and timber management. So, not necessarily totally breakthrough technology, but certainly applying a technology that's been developed for one industry into another one with some thoughtful software and kind of layers of the tech that enable it to be done. And then, of course, there's a hardware element to it.
Yes, Sarah.
What are some of the most exciting companies or startups and products that you're the most excited about to see in the next 5 years?
I can tell you one that's in our cohort now. And Susan knows this one as well because it used to be a HAX company, or not used to, it still is a HAX company, but it's called Colibri. And so they are looking at how to reimagine bioreactors, which, as you can imagine, and given the manufacturing and bioeconomy conversation, is really exciting. And the thing that I find really exciting about them isn't that they're just building a brand new bioreactor. It's that they are actually looking at different ways of growing cells within that bioreactor. So for me, what I get excited about is when I see someone who is saying like, okay, we've done something, or this is how something has been done for many, many years, but how can we reimagine a different way of doing it? And I think that can often set companies apart when we look at a bunch of different decks, which we see quite frequently. Really kind of like what is the value proposition and what makes this thing, as you were saying, like rise to the top. And I think Colibri is a really good example of that.
Yeah, Colibri is using acoustic waves, which I think have been in the academic literature about how to sort of manipulate cell culture for many years, but now they're taking that type of technology and industrializing it. So that's quite exciting. For us, I think, electrochemistry is a really exciting space. We're seeing a lot of interesting companies that are leveraging electrochemistry. We think that critical minerals are a big space. We have such a huge demand for things like lithium, as well as nickel, cobalt. Copper is a big one, where the need for that is just going to skyrocket in order to support the energy transition and electrification. So we have a pretty exciting company called Stillbright. They're using a new type of, using electrochemistry to improve refining of copper in a much more eco-friendly way. And it's exciting because copper is mined. There's a lot of copper in the US and kind of distributed globally, but the issue is that refining some of that can't be done here locally because it's such a toxic and kind of polluting process. So all of that ends up getting shipped over to China, processed there, and then shipped back. So of course that has a huge carbon footprint, and it just makes us very reliant on these distant trading partners to be able to get those critical minerals. So that's a big area for us that we're looking for more and more companies in. Another one for me is advanced materials. I think there's been so much done at the interface of AI and machine learning around biology and biotech and kind of how we manage that data and use it to push forward and accelerate the discovery of new organisms that can do new things. I think using that in the materials space and finding ways to combine, advanced materials with a machine learning and sort of data-based approach is super interesting. I think it's also challenging, but something that we're really interested in.
I think maybe one more space that I've been trying to find companies in as well is, because for the SOSV ethos, it's, like I said earlier, finding founders who are working on solving problems for human and planetary health. But I think from my point of view first, around human health is around women's health too, and not just things around like reproductive health. I think there's some things like lung disease or heart disease that impact women differently than men, and so finding like who are the individuals and working in these spaces, kind of what is basic science saying about this, and how can we turn those results and those findings into tools and technologies to support companies in the women's health space. Karen?
I've been thinking about how to answer that, and it's hard for me to think about specific companies, but I think about it more systemically. So, when you talk about different ways of growing cells, or when you think about like using a plant as a biofoundry, like all these different types of ways of using biology for different purposes is what gets me super excited, and a lot of that is happening in companies, and I don't know, I hesitate to say which ones. You guys probably know better than I do. I have less knowledge about the New York area than other places, but yeah, I mean, I like the cultured food, cultured meat, cultured cheese, whatever area has always been interesting to me, because I feel like it relates a lot to like cell culture in general, and a lot of the issues you have to resolve with that are the same with like test beds for medicinals and stuff like that, So yeah, like scaffolds and food and all those things. So it's really hard for me to like pinpoint a company. I more think about like systemic stuff.
I want to bring up one point that we talked about on our prep call, and that is the democratization of science and how it's driven diversification in the leadership of science now. I mean, there's 4 women sitting on this panel. When we had our prep call, we were all women on the prep call. This was unheard of in the early days of SINBRC. There was one principal investigator who was a woman. Her name was Pamela Silver, and she was out of Harvard. And everyone else was men. And so, you made the comment, I think, about making sure that the people who are making decisions about these kinds of technologies and how they're applied, they're widely represented in terms of, gender and other characteristics, so that it truly is democratization.
Yeah, and I think it's important when we think about kind of the makeup of our cohorts, it's not just what kinds of problems are they solving, but who is solving those problems and for what communities are they solving them for.
Right.
Again, like I was saying earlier, I know a lot of the conversation is around biomanufacturing and bioeconomy, but there's other spaces that need attention and support and financial resources as well. So it's, a point I was making earlier, right? Like how can we bring so many people together where on the surface it might look like they have disparate backgrounds, but we need all of those voices to make sure that the technologies are being made in ethical and responsible ways, but then are also being brought out into the communities and used in ways that support and actually solve the problem that they say that they're solving for.
Right. I mean, I think it's as amazing as you see there are many, many female CEOs on our panels today. And that is really exciting. And I think this area, even more so than other areas of science and commercialization, is at the forefront for women in leadership in science. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.